Picture this. The streets were cold, shrouded in mist, as if hiding from time itself. Behind the veil of medieval shadows, those without a hearth or a hay-stuffed sack were mere whispers in the wind. For the poor and homeless, existence in the Dark Ages was a grim tapestry woven from invisible threads. They stood outside society, abandoned like worn-out boots in the mud. No roofs waited to shelter them from the biting chill. And charity was a distant dream often traded for guilt or servitude. In this harsh, unforgiving world, poverty wasn't a fleeting plight. It was a relentless predator. Music. Let's step into the shadows of the medieval world where the unfortunate souls in the darkest corners of towns and villages were not just unseen but often unwelcome. These homeless individuals were more than just poor. They were the displaced peasants from warden lands, debt-riddled beggars traveling from village to village, widows and orphans left with no family, constantly drifting and searching for sustenance. They walked through life forsaken by society's rigid structure, slipping into obscurity. Without land or a master, their existence went unrecorded, making them as unnoticed as ghosts amid the noise of medieval life. Living without land anchored these people in a precarious limbo. In such a hierarchical society, not having a home was like having no identity at all, leaving them vulnerable to nature's fury and human indifference. Stripped of rights and significance, they were cast aside, perceived as nuisances rather than as neighbors, turning a blind eye to their struggles amidst the cobblestone streets. Society deemed these destitute souls sinful and distrusted them, thinking their plight was nothing more than a manifestation of moral failure. Homelessness threatened the very values rooted in property and lineage, and religious teachings often echoed this suspicion, marking them as idle, stained souls, or worse yet, carriers of disease and misfortune. This stigma not only isolated them but also dehumanized them, stripping away their dignity and rights. Accusations of witchcraft often loomed over them in times of crisis when communities sought someone to blame for the latest epidemic or crop failure. Trapped in a vicious cycle, they were ostracized for their misfortune, denied the opportunity to reintegrate into society, and then punished for their struggle to survive, through means that were judged as improper. Their existence became a twisted tale of battling both the elements and a society that relegated them to the shadows. These were not just lives lived without roofs, but lives devoid of even the barest ability. Unlike today, where shelters can offer a brief respite, medieval society offered no such sanctuaries. Instead, the homeless sought shelter amid ruins, forest clearings, or beneath bustling market stalls, providing little protection from the wind, rain, or dangers prowling in the night. Their transient existence kept them in constant movement, driven away by authorities who saw them as a blight and forced into nomadic lifestyles, always left questioning where they might lay their heads for the night. Without land or protection, these individuals faced perils as real as they were constant. Owning land meant security and safety, and those without it became easy targets for exploitation and violence. Alone on the roads or hidden in gloomy corners, the homeless were vulnerable to attack with bandits roaming the countryside and violence, lurking in many shadows. The law, instead of offering refuge, compounded their hardships by criminalizing vagrancy with severe penalties like whipping or confinement. Lacking land, these individuals existed in an endless peril, forever exposed to both human malice and the law's heavy hand. While Christian doctrine urged charity and mercy, labeling the suffering as opportunities for salvation, authorities often saw the homeless differently. The pressure to maintain urban order meant the homeless were swept off the streets and shunned by city leaders who saw them as carriers of disease and disruptors of tranquility. This paradoxical dynamic reflected deep societal divides, viewing the homeless as either deserving recipients of charity or as bothersome pariahs. Diving into the legal frameworks of the time reveals an exclusionary system that rendered the homeless invisible. Vagrancy laws transformed their unfortunate conditions into criminal behavior, with punishments ranging from fines and public shame to physical punishment. These laws reduced landlessness to a crime, thrusting the homeless into an ambiguous legal space where protection and rights were scarce. Bereft of legal identity, they were excluded from many communal activities, their voices unheard in a society that valued order above all. With the church straddling a line between benevolence and condemnation, its role was both a comfort and a judgment. Despite offering food and shelter, there were strings attached as religious views portrayed poverty as a potential sign of moral failing. Relief came with demands for penance, showing how the church's support was tinged with expectations and judgments. Medieval literature and folklore painted the homeless in nuanced hues, casting them as figures of scorn or wearers of wisdom. Folktales treated them as cautionary figures, whereas chronicle writers might glimpse their humanity in passing, highlighting the contradictions inherent in society's views on poverty. Facing stigma, the homeless were paras marked by poverty. Mistrusted, barred from vital societal centers like guilds and markets. Exclusion reinforced their isolation, casting them as visible reminders of humanity's failures. The legacy of these invisible lives prompts us to confront our current societal structures, urging a conscious rethinking of how to approach poverty. By recognizing the struggles of the medieval homeless, modern societies can opt for an empathetic response, crafting paths of change where poverty is not a fate of silence, but a challenge for all to address transparently and compassionately. Music. The medieval winter was not merely a season. It held a relentless grip of hardship and despair, especially for the poor and homeless. With no modern means to battle the bitter cold, people faced a natural enemy, as fearsome as any invading army. The winter chill seeped into bones, leaving many numb to their very souls, their bodies wrapped in garments so thin that they seemed made of the very ice that assaulted them. Seeking refuge wherever it might exist, they huddled beneath bridges, nestled into the density of bush, or pressed up against barn doors, snatching at any sliver of warmth like a bird pecking at crumbs. Shelter was scarce and seldom offered more than false security against the biting winds. In desperation, some dug shallow pits in the earth, hoping to escape the icy dread above. Unaware that the cold within the ground harbored no less malice, the lack of footwear meant the frost. Bitten dared not linger, pushing through the snow with bare feet. Each step a torturous negotiation with the frostbite that would eventually claim them. Meanwhile, the fires that saved life were but fleeting dreams to those without a hearth. Firewood was fiercely guarded, a prize few dared to steal, and even the rare flames they sparked struggled against the damp air, flickering bravely before surrendering. Such fleeting warmth provided more illusion than protection, forcing many to seek warmth through communal gatherings, clinging to each other, as if their lives depended on it, which it often did. Frostbite stood as yet another insidious foe. Fingers and toes trembled under the relentless attack of ice and wind, becoming useless and swollen, strapped ineffectively to palms in hopes of regaining functionality. Without the advantage of medical knowledge, frostbite could segue into infection all too easily, leading to disfigurement or worse. Tales that echo through time as tragic reminders of the symbiosis between a harsh environment and societal neglect. The biting wind had partners in misery, chillblades, hypothermia, and trenchfoot. Ailments born from endurance in harsh conditions, debilitating in their insidiousness. Any lack of preparation only hastened the body's surrender, casting victims into desolation, collapsing into the embrace of a relentless freeze that neither cared nor hesitated. Beyond the grave threat of exposure lay the wretched fate of those who slept unsheltered. Night fell like a predatory cloak over the land, temperatures plummeting and leaving those caught beneath the stars to shiver and weep, lungs aching with the effort to draw in the piercing air. In a search for insulation, they piled leaves upon themselves or pressed into clusters with animals, whether fellow wanderers or livestock, combining what warmth they could muster. Still, the bitterness of the cold wove its path among them, and many found their eternal respite come morning. The discovery of frozen bodies was a grim dawn routine often met with resigned acceptance. Reminders to those who survived of the lottery, fate they played daily. The few garments owned by the poor offered scant defense against the elements and inadequate armor, stitched with nature's own frigid threads. Wool was for those with means. Others made do with ragged layers, pulling the inessential close in hopes of trapping imaginary warmth. Shoes, if possessed, were treasures and often passed along like heirlooms. For the less fortunate, the only option was binding feet with cloth or stitching together makeshift soles from straw or earth, offering meager opposition against the winter's cruel onslaught. And as each body fell to the ground, stiff with cold before being removed quietly in the morning, their stories faded into silence, forgotten among the icy whispers. Some communities made valiant attempts to grasp at solutions. Almshouses or temporary shelters sprang up only to crumble under resource constraints or societal prejudice. Moreover, the choice to stay rural or seek refuge within city confines carried its own share of miseries. Rural communities, supportive though they often tried to be, harbored suspicions rooted in survivalism. Still, they sometimes offered shared sustenance or bartered help. Urban areas with their rugged stones and narrow streets promised much, but delivered little, often blaming the poor for sickness or barring them altogether. Despite daunting adversity, there were tailies of light amid the harshness. The homeless showed remarkable resilience, banding together against the cold's grip. With shared resources and body heat, a communal warmth amidst the ice. In the face of chilling despair, the human spirit glowed defiantly, casting a light forged from empathy and shared struggle. Some found hope in superstition, lighting candles or donning amulets to keep the wickedness of the cold at bay. Rituals painted scenes of desperate faith where the unexplainable gloom met a community's hopeful resistance. Ultimately, as spring unveiled its gentle touch and the earth thawed, those who survived carried with them tales of endurance and loss. Their marks by frost whispered of the frost's bygone cruelty in hushed tones, serving as both cautionary tales and poignant lamentations. Each winter's tale became a firelit narrative, a hedge against the next bitter season that hung on the horizon like an ever-looming specter. History etched in ice, waiting to chill another day. In the medieval world, hunger was a constant specter that haunted the less fortunate, a grim companion in their daily struggle for survival. Agriculture in these times was an unpredictable affair. Farmers faced the whims of nature, armed with rudimentary tools, wooden plows, and sickles, knowing that a single drought or storm could spell disaster. The absence of modern techniques meant a small farmer's life was a precarious balancing act. Without synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, their crops were vulnerable to pests and diseases, leading to unpredictable yields. This was subsistence. Agriculture at its harshest, where the margins for error were razor-thin and the threat of famine loomed ever large. When you walked the muddy lanes of a medieval village, the air often carried the musty scent of rot from food stores that couldn't be preserved. In these tight-knit communities, food scarcity was an anxiety that wove itself into the fabric of daily life. For the landless and homeless, survival was an even bleaker affair. Their hopes pinned on the fickle goodwill of the church or wealthier neighbors. When harvest failed or times grew tough, this lifeline could vanish overnight, rendering hunger a certainty for many. Bread, the cornerstone of medieval sustenance, was ironically absent from the tables of many poor families. It was the food of choice for those who had means made from wheat, rye, or barley. Yet for the impoverished, a loaf often became an unattainable luxury. When grain supplies dwindled, they turned to curious substitutes like acorns or even sawdust. Concoctions that tested not only palates, but stomachs. Bread was a symbol of harsh division. The wealthy indulged in soft white loaves while the poor chewed on coarse dark bread. Stark reminders of societal disparities. To survive, the destitute often relied on their knowledge of the natural world. Foraging became a necessity as they scoured forests for edible plants, roots, and leaves. They gathered what others dismissed as weeds, relying on instinct and insight to separate the nourishing from the dangerous. This foraging life wasn't without peril. Many plants threatened with their toxicity, and those caught trespassing on private lands faced punishment. Yet the deadly and delightful grew side by side, and discerning the difference was as much a survival skill as knowing how to wield a sickle. Famine, the grim reaper of medieval times, came as a frequent and unwelcome visitor. History recounted tales of crippling food shortages, where entire societies crumbled under the weight of starvation's cruel hand. The Great Famine of the early 14th century painted a grim picture of widespread despair. Prices soared, and as resources dwindled, communities were forced into desperate measures, including theft and, in nightmarish instances, cannibalism. Monastery gates became beacons of hope for salvation, though resources even there were finite and often quickly consumed. For many impoverished souls, begging was a last resort. A plea for kindness met with suspicion and disdain. The act of asking for alms, seen by some as necessary charity, painted others as idle and deceitful. In bustling towns and villages, these figures were a fixture navigating a thin line between survival and societal scorn. Churches and monasteries, bastions of hope for some, offered assistance wrapped in conditions of spiritual obligation. In exchange for aid, one might find themselves confessing or laboring under ecclesiastical watch, revealing the dichotomy of charity and control prevalent in these religious institutions. Food hierarchy in medieval times drew stark lines. The wealthy enjoyed lavish feasts replete with meats and exotic spices, while the poor often subsisted on meager bowls of GRL or bread padded with cheap fillers. Scraps from the tables of the rich occasionally provided unexpected nourishment for the destitute, who scavenged these discarded morsels under the constant threat of punishment. This scavenging lifestyle showed the resilience and creativity of people forced to make do with what they could find. As the season shifted, so too did the hardships, with each year bringing lean months where supplies grew perilously low. Many communities banded together, sharing what's left. But for those on the fringes, such safety nets were often out of reach. The upper classes, insulated by their wealth, weathered these downturns with relative ease, their pantries secure against the vagaries of the agricultural calendar. Meanwhile, the poor battled hunger and malnutrition, their bodies as fragile as frost-touched leaves. Hunger's tale in the Dark Ages was one of unyielding cycles where societal structures repeatedly confined the impoverished to lives of need. Every empty hand feeds into a system where food scarcity, disease, and death are drawn in a relentless spiral. Yet amidst this bleakness, tales of survival emerge, pockets of hope shining through the dark folds of history. For some, the rare opportunities found in charity or alliances offered a way out. Their stories remind us of the enduring spirit of humanity. In medieval times, hunger wasn't just a physical affliction. It was a constant companion that etched itself into the human spirit, a shadow that neither power nor time could fully erase. In the medieval world, disease thrived and tormented the vulnerable, particularly those poor souls existing at the fringes of society. Life without soap or clean water bred an environment ripe for infections where a lack of understanding allowed illnesses to run rampant unchecked and misunderstood. Human and animal waste littered roadsides, creating a quagmire of filth that permeated life-fostering bacteria and sickness. Simple infections easily treatable today grew into life-threatening perils. Carrying the scent of fear and the tangible biting sting of premature death, the crowded, unsanitary conditions of makeshift camp saw diseases leap eagerly between bodies. Underpinned by a grim resignation of inevitability, an incessant bedfellow of those times, lice crawled ceaselessly through layers of unwashed clothing, their presence a reminder of desperation. These tiny tormentors bore more than an itch. They were harbingers of typhus, inflicting misery with fevers as fiery as the passions of the era's wandering preachers. Scabies too dug beneath the skin, leaving behind tracks of torment and weeping. Sores that defied closure. Despite folk remedies marinated in herbs and mysticism, relief remained elusive. The itch, persistent as poverty itself, sapped strength and underscored a relentless struggle to simply remain alive. Children, innocent of the larger world's burdens, bore the double crown of youthful weakness and relentless parasite, as they scratched themselves roar into vulnerability. An invisible killer far more pervasive than its victims realized roamed. Its name whispered in fear and resignation: dysentery, The scourge thrived where filth reigned, stripping men, women, and children of vitality through merciless bouts of fever and diarrhea. Water drawn from polluted streams was the silent betrayer, turning vitality into a gaunt shadow of exhaustion, hunger, and unending thirst. Remedies, prayers, herbal brews, and well-meaning incantations could not stand against the march of dehydration. Each outbreak echoed the powerlessness of ignorance and the tyranny of survival's most base needs. Looming even larger was the specter of the plague, a specter casting long shadows where grim existences crumbled into anonymity. The infamous Black Death surged as a force of nature, indifferent to wealth or power but seemingly cruel to those already humbled by life. In packed hovels where privacy was luxury, the very air seemed to vibrate with the hum of impending doom. As plague-weary eyes watched loved ones succumb in heaps of agony and fear, fragrant herbs clutched against the miasma offered scant protection. Society sought to appease its fear with scapegoats scattering blame like seeds of chaos, as if guilt could halt death's steady approach. Living in a medieval landscape of bleak certainties, baffling diseases that defied reason but captured vivid imaginations seemed cloaked in divine mystery. Some, like St. Anthony's fire, burned with the eye of God's displeased, their mortal warnings, misread signs from beyond. The unknown bred superstitions where explanations of malades came steeped in belief rather than biology. Shuffling rituals emerged, designed not to cure but to fend off the shame of moral failings perceived in others. Caught in the relentless swing between fate and folly, solutions lay obscured in shadows too dark to illuminate. In desperation, many sought deliverance from the quacks and charlatans hawking their wares in bustling marketplaces and squalid alleys. Bloodletting, the cutting of life to save it, was a standard cry, a misunderstood intervention that mixed truth with tragedy. In dangerous measure, potions tinged with ambition rather than effectiveness, crafted from the oddest of ingredients, promised salvation but delivered disappointment. In the absence of science, folklore bound communities in tales as rich as their lives were poor, giving meager hope through the telling, if not the healing. Mental health was another frontier of fear and misunderstanding. Here, demons danced in the public square, their names invoked as explanations for the inexplicable turns of the mind. In the eyes of the medieval world, madness was the company of the sinful and the mark of the cursed. Cruelty disguised as cure, a whispered exorcism here, a brutal confinement there, served only to deepen society's rejection of those who deviated from an invisible norm. And then there was leprosy, the most visible testament to the interplay of disease and disdain. Seen as a curse manifest, those marked by its blemishes were pushed to the edges, their homes stony colonies of ostracism. Leprosy feared more for its symbolic contagion than its actual spread, thrust sufferers into a social exile reinforced by misunderstanding. Part moral punishment, part medical, this disease left spirits void and bodies marked, its victims often turning to prayer as their final protest against the dark judgment of the world. In the end, amid all the suffering and squalor, those enduring poverty bore also an indomitable resilience and ingrained hope twined through communal song and whispered prayer. Against the backdrop of grinding despair, these flickers of humanity shone. They shared meager scraps, built networks of waning strength, and wrapped themselves in layers of belief and myth to keep warmth in frigid nights. In solemn silence or communal chorus, the spirit of survival threaded through them like a fine golden thread in the fabric of medieval darkness. A stark reminder that beneath the filthy rags of history's forgotten, the human heart pulsed fiercely on. In the gritty tapestry of the medieval world, the homeless found themselves as outlaws by necessity, often tiptoeing the thin line between survival and legality. Begging, the last resort for many with nowhere else to turn, was ironically banned in numerous regions. Seen not as a plea for help, but as a societal nuisance, it was criminalized in a society where wealth was equated with divine virtue and poverty was mistakenly equated with moral failing. As these embattled souls traversed towns and village marketplaces, They met with cold stares and hostility, accused of exploiting the virtues of the charitable. Yet, without skills or property, the downtrodden often turned to theft as a last desperate measure driven by the relentless gnaw of hunger. Despite living alongside this continuous struggle, the gentry and commoners tightened their grips on their possessions, sheltered from the perpetual scarcity that nudged the poor into these perilous choices. Once caught stealing, the consequences were harsh, ranging from public whippings to severe mutilation, affirming society's grim perception of poverty as a moral rather than a circumstantial flaw. In towns where sanitation was a tossed-off luxury, the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs were thrust upon those with no other recourse. Waste disposal was neither a public service nor clean work, but a relentless, desperate occupation for those deemed expendable. These individuals, often unseen and unappreciated, scoured cesspits and waterways, ridding towns of their filth, trading their health and dignity for mere survival. In the quiet pre-dawn hours, laborers trudged through streets with shovels and rakes, battling heaps of waste in a thankless task that endangered their lives while performing essential services to public health. Exposed to all manner of pathogens and toxic fumes, they faced a life expectancy brutally killed by their daily toil. Shunned by society once their work was done, these cleaners epitomized the era's cruel paradox. Vital yet invisible, their humanity overshadowed by the very muck they removed. For those with the privilege of gainful employment, the medieval labor landscape was fraught with hazard. Life in the mines or quarries meant confronting unspeakable dangers, with miners navigating perilous conditions deep underground with only primitive tools to chip away at unforgiving rock. Each chisel stroke threatened rockfalls or suffocation. In an unyielding darkness, pierced only by flickering lamps, social status dictated who shouldered these burdens, pushing those without safer options into the earth's depths at the behest of merciless overseers. Despite the looming threat of crushed bones and respiratory diseases, they toiled for paltry wages. Their sacrifices whispered amidst the cacophony of indifference that greeted their plight. Beyond the depths of mines, the land itself held threats. For farm workers, the backbone of medieval society, from dawn's first light, their lives were governed by the rhythm of planting and harvest, constantly shadowed by nature's idiosyncrasies. With sharp tools in hand, they weaved through expansive fields, every misstep a potential brush with death, as unexpected storms and wild beasts lurked ever present. Despite their critical role in feeding the nation, these laborers' safety and welfare were secondary concerns to the affluent who prize productivity over the human cost of cultivation. In the bustling marketplace, artisans labored to master their crafts under the constraints of feudal pressures and guild demands. Blacksmiths, weavers, and potters channeled their skill into creation. Though their livelihood hung in precarious balance, the heat of forges, the dye's acrid scent, and hours of relentless practice stained their hands and lungs, all for diminishing returns in an unforgiving economy. Artisans faced fierce competition, and failure to sell their wares threatened ruin, sharpening the edges of already meager lives. Their mastery, valuable only in the marketplace, offered little room for innovation or personal advancement. Constrained by guild rules and feudal edicts, the mercantile world beckoned to some as a means to escape the land. Yet it was a double-edged sword. Merchants navigating the medieval landscape were beset by dangers on every side. As they plied goods between distant towns, bandits lurked along roads ready to strike, while weather and prejudice added layers of challenge. For those of modest means, the gamble of merchant life was fraught with risk. Each successful trade, a minor victory against nature's and man's unpredictability. Lastly, when all else failed, some turned to life as mercenaries, wielding swords for coin in battles dictated by the whims of royalty and nobility. These warriors for hire navigated a life teetering on the edge of survival, constantly adapting to shifting allegiances and the brutality of medieval warfare. In an existence punctuated by momentary triumphs and enduring threats, mercenaries embodied the medieval era's relentless struggle to survive against all odds and embrace peril with little promise of reward. Children born into the unforgiving world of medieval poverty often began life with hungry cries that echoed unanswered. In dimly lit huts or bustling alleyways, infants lay swaddled in whatever scraps of cloth their parents could muster. Hunger seemed to be a constant companion, gnawing incessantly. Mothers, deprived of proper nourishment themselves, could scarcely produce enough milk, leaving their infants to rely on thin, unsanitary gruels made from diluted bread. The lack of vitamins and clean water meant that simple ailments left untreated became fatal, claiming many young lives before they even had the chance to flourish. Surviving those first fragile months was only the beginning. The environment remained a harsh adversary with chilling winters stealing warmth right from the cradle. Babies huddled together with exhausted mothers, their breath creating tiny clouds in the frosty air. Infections untreated due to poor access to medicine swept through these makeshift homes like a silent storm. The fortunate few who survived these early trials were often perceived as either cursed or blessed. Small survivors bound to lives of continuous struggle from the very start. As soon as these children could walk, they were swept into the web of survival. The concept of a carefree childhood was as elusive as a mirage. Play was a luxury quickly replaced by toil, as little hands were put to work in fields, households, or alongside their elders learning trades. The labor was grueling and hazardous, often carried out in environments indifferent to the safety of young workers. Injuries were commonplace, and those suffering were left with even deeper scars of poverty's relentless grip. For some unfortunate souls, being an extra hand meant servitude in exchange for scant meals or a roof overhead. Domestic service often took them into the slightly better-off homes. Yet the hardships remained unchanged. A childhood marked by labor yielded frayed hearts, burdened early by a system that resisted change. The dreams and innocence we cherish in children today were luxuries these medieval youngsters could hardly imagine, if at all. Desperation forced some parents into heartbreaking decisions, abandoning their offspring in hopes that monasteries or churches might extend a helping hand. Other children, left to chance or cruel necessity, joined roving bands of street children, learning to survive by begging, stealing, or negotiating a life's daily challenges. These abandonment tales are not merely physical but emotional. As families steeled themselves against the pain of such a loss to continue living, survivors grew up feeling disposable, their view of the world shaped by a harsh, unforgiving reality. Exploitation was a brutal reality. Children became commodities valued solely for their usefulness. Forced into thievery or under the guise of apprenticeships, they endured grueling work with little food or care. Society, unmoved by their suffering, allowed abuse to flourish, with punishment meted out as disciplinary harshness. Cuts, bruises, and broken spirits left deep scars, both visible and hidden, whispered through the years. A harsh chorus against the backdrop of idealized medieval life. Orphaned by circumstance, children often formed makeshift families, gathering strength in numbers. Driven by necessity, they created loose-knit communities with older children assuming leadership roles. These bonds, while born out of adversity, cultivated resilience and a stubborn determination to endure. Some communities, though offering minimal acceptance, let these young wanderers live on the periphery, fueled by sporadic kindness amidst constant vigilance. For some, the call to arms as child soldiers came as a horrific rite of passage. Wars, bereft of their men, forced the young into battle, where they learned to survive conflicts their minds could scarcely grasp. Battlefields robbed them of innocence and peace, often irrevocably altering their spirit. Perilous roles were not limited to warfare. Many found themselves as messengers or participants in dangerous schemes. This constant shadow of danger shattered the comfort childhood should afford, thrusting them into a brash adulthood. In towns, child thieves were an inevitable byproduct of dire need, learning to pickpocket or steal just to fill their bellies. Those caught were brutalized by public punishment. The unbearable sting of the whip, the humiliation of the stockades, these punishments left indelible marks, branding them and cementing future paths riddled with peril. Yet society offered no redemption, condemning them before they had a chance to make amends. Medieval childhood was also haunted by superstition. Fear ran alongside the tangible fears of hunger and disease. Charms, chants, and superstitions like changeling myths filled the void left by rational medical help, casting long shadows over young lives. Even earnest parental love often took on frantic undertones of magical desperation, leaving children in a haze of mixed reality and myth. Nevertheless, despite the surrounding despair, children often became unexpected beacons of hope. Their laughter and play were meager lights in a darkened world, softening even the stonest hearts. Communities, however strict, saw in their youth a glimpse of potential futures, anchoring dreams of a better life. They embodied the fragile line between surviving and thriving, enduring amidst medieval hardship against stark odds, living testaments to resilience and the enduring spark of childhood spirit. The silent echoes of their stories continue to resonate, haunting the whispers of history with near soundless yet powerful clarity. In the medieval world, merely existing as a poor wanderer was enough to brand you a criminal. The laws of those times were intended not just to punish but to maintain control over the impoverished masses, weaving a net around those who found themselves on the social fringes. Even without committing actual crimes, these individuals were dragged before local authorities for the mere act of surviving without land or steady employment. This was rooted in a medieval mindset that equated poverty with moral failure, a notion that turned wandering souls into perceived threats that needed managing. This wasn't simply about stopping any real danger. More fundamentally, it was about ensuring those without power remained visible targets for authority, thus keeping the poor both seen and subservient. Once caught in this legal web, punishment was swift and brutal, whipping a public spectacle executed with little mercy left visible scars, broadcasting shame and ensuring the community was reminded of the consequences of stepping out of line. These acts weren't just to chastise the offender, but rather to reinforce societal boundaries, making entertainment of others pain a community affair. Branding was another grim punishment, marking bodies permanently with letters to signify supposed crimes. Imagine wearing your conviction on your flesh for all to see, like a human billboard of societal disdain. Yet these immediate punishments were not the entirety of their sentences. Often those labeled as criminals found themselves conscripted into hard labor, forced to sustain the very structures that marginalized them. It was a cycle of oppression where the same society that ostracized them exploited their toil, feeding off both their physical and spiritual exhaustion. In some cases, these individuals were coerced into military service, a death sentence disguised as duty, providing kings with soldiers by sacrificing those already forsaken at home. Public humiliation, another weapon in the medieval arsenal, saw people locked in stocks or pillories in public squares. Surrounded by jeering crowds, individuals endured all nature of mockery and scorn. These spectacles weren't personal. It was a communal ritual, drawing lines between law-abiding citizens and those labeled as outcasts. Through these acts, social order seemed to cement itself even further, repelling any notion of empathy for those ridiculed. Sometimes the harsh hand of the law culminated in banishment, a severe penalty that stripped individuals of community ties and resources, sent into the unforgiving unknown. Many found survival an impossibility, as records grimly attest. With their stories often ending in tragedy, the systematic initiation into a life without refuge became a chilling narrative of medieval justice, one that ensured even compliant souls couldn't escape a predetermined path of doom. The words woven into legal text of the era reveal a society steeped in fear and suspicion. Laws describe the poor in language that entrenched social hierarchies, their verbose condemnations turning poverty into criminality. However, under this harsh exterior, evidence of resistance flickers, a defiant humanity against the legal machinery. An undercurrent of stories narrating the irrational hope clinging to life. Beyond the ink on parchment, community vigilance did its part in maintaining the order. Neighbors policed one another, reinforcing law through shared scrutiny. The constant watchfulness of the medieval populace created a culture of fear-based compliance, deterring any deviance from accepted norms. This communal enforcement turned everyone into part-time guards of the unstated law. Yet amid this oppression, small acts of defiance flickered like candlelight in the darkness. Families quietly shielded those on the run, or towns turned a blind eye to preserve their own, subverting the harshness of laws through acts of empathy. Even when legality demanded severity, human compassion found ways to slip through the cracks. An enduring testament to the perseverance of the spirit against overwhelming odds. The Church too provided its own paradoxical layer, serving as spiritual guide and enforcer. It wielded dual power, at times tempering state brutality with mercy, at others reinforcing the punitive with divine justification. This complicated the landscape of justice with clerical influence, sometimes swaying sovereign decisions, thus creating a strange balance between divine compassion and earthly retribution. The stories of those subjected to these laws cast long shadows, their tales continuing to inform modern narratives of poverty and punishment. Through folk tales and collective memory, medieval echoes shape our understanding of systemic injustice woven through history. As these stories thread their way through our culture today, they remind us of a grim past that is as instructive as it is haunting. A somber tapestry interwoven with the enduring spirit of those who once walked unseen roads. The medieval world of religion was a tapestry of light and shadow, where monasteries stood as symbols of both hope and judgment. Walking barefoot along the dusty paths towards these sacred places, the poor found a paradox waiting for them. Monasteries, with their thick stone walls and echoing hallways, were sanctuaries offering solace for the hungry and shelterless. Here the smell of baking bread was a beacon drawing the desperate closer, yet entry carried its own price, a toll paid not in coin but in devotion. Those who sought aid encountered rituals that were as much about religious conformity as they were about survival. One might receive a crust of bread only after joining a lengthy prayer in a hushed chapel or confessing sins with bowed head beneath an ancient vated ceiling. In these moments, hunger was more than a physical state. It was a gauntlet of spiritual trials, the monks and friars seeing service as divine duty, balanced acts of charity with the expectation of piety from the needy souls at their gates. Despite these rigid rites, monasteries became lifelines during times of famine, giving what little they could from the yields of their gardens and the herds they tended. But the help they extended was not without conditions. They often required fields tilled or wood chopped, forging an unspoken pact between sustenance and servitude. The varied degrees of generosity reflected the differences in monastic orders and locations, some being warm-hearted in their aid, others cautious and reserved. Beyond the physical aid, the Church wielded charity as a powerful tool to maintain control over its flock. As influential social and spiritual authorities, Church leaders preached that suffering was either a test from God or a result of sin. By nurturing this narrative, they justified the rigid structures of society with charity dispensed alongside strict moral lessons. Their records, meticulously kept, did not merely count loaves given, but also sins confessed, creating an economy of salvation where spiritual and physical needs tangled. As one listened to sermons from cold, echoing cathedrals, the spiritual dichotomy became clear. Poverty was paradoxically both blessed and cursed. Saints like Francis of Assisi embraced their destitution, hailed as paragons of virtue called poverty. Yet others, perhaps more sternly sanctified, portrayed it as a trial of divine displeasure. The Church's teachings invariably held sway, instilling reverence and resignation among those crushed by life's burdens. The tales of saints walked hand in hand with both comfort and conviction. Some saints were celebrated for kindness and mercy, such as Martin of Tours, whose act of sharing his cloak with a beggar rippled through the ages as divine benevolence incarnate. But darker tales loomed, those of saints who warned the impoverished about the soul's peril, invoking the specter of punishment for moral flaws. These stories exalted charity's virtue, but also reinforced a celestial reminder that echoed with judgment. For many of the destitute, Relics and pilgrimages infused with the scent of incense and the hope of miracles were beacons promising salvation. Pilgrims, whether frail or hale, undertook these arduous journeys in quest of divine favor, hoping that touching a relic might ignite a spark of divine intervention in their faltering lives. Yet the outcome often mirrored the Church's doctrine. Those who returned unchanged were left pondering their spiritual shortcomings. In this web of faith and obligation, the tithe hung as a burdensome yoke, mandating 1/10 of one's earnings or harvest for the Church, pressing heavily on those already diminished by poverty. Alms, too, while voluntary, were weighed with the promise of heavenly reprisal or favor. Here the economics of faith mixed uncomfortably with survival, as every coin given chipped away at already scarce resources. Confession stood as a ritual of profound significance. It offered absolution, yes, but also served as a means of control. A dance of power where priests in their woven woolen robes wielded the authority to forgive or admonish. The poor's acts of desperation spilled forth into dark wooden confessionals, becoming accounts of sin in need of spiritual cleansing. The confessional thus dwelt as both refuge and courtroom, an intimate vehicle for ecclesiastical influence over moral conduct. Rituals and superstitions weaved their way through daily lives where sacred and profane mingled, lighting a candle, sprinkling holy water. Every act petitioned for divine favor or sought to appease an often inscrutable deity. With the Church's hand guiding the definition of right from wrong, villages delicately balanced between practices it endorsed and those it condemned as heresy. Ultimately, the Church's relationship with societal hierarchies was one of reinforcement. Through sermons and actions, the divergence of fortune was reinforced, as providential design, with every whispered psalm serving as both a song of hope and an echo of despair. Within these gray walls of belief, spirituality offered a vision of an eventual heaven, but also a stark reflection of life's grueling inequities. Those under the yoke of poverty seeking solace found instead that spirituality embodied a reality as comforting as it was confining, a constant dance of consolation shadowed by judgment. In the medieval imagination, cities like London, Paris, or Prague shimmered with the allure of opportunity, promising work, community, and a hint of dignity absent in the countryside. Life in rural areas was a communal struggle, with communities hard-pressed to offer help to the destitute. As fellow villagers suggested seeking fortunes in bustling urban centers, with the wealthy flaunting their riches amidst the poverty-stricken masses. Cities seemed like a rational escape from the relentless despair of village life. Yet upon arrival, the harsh reality became stark. Overburdened cities couldn't accommodate the swelling tide of migrants. The streets, rather than providing a refuge, revealed the same poverty as in the fields left behind. Desperation kept wages low and hopes of upward mobility shattered against the hard cobblestones. Survival in this labyrinth of opportunity and pitfalls was as precarious in the city as the village, a realization that escape might never truly come. The city gates, guarded by watchful eyes, served as barriers for the aimless wanderer. Outsiders were met with suspicion, as their arrival meant more beggars on the streets, more overcrowded alleys and mouths to feed, perceived threats to social order. The guards, far from ushering in new residents with open arms, often turned away hopeful souls, leaving them to pursue shadowed paths, their dreams dashed by the city's unyielding judgment. Even those who managed to slip past the gates found themselves under vigilant watch, apprehended and expelled with a swift ferocity that echoed through the narrow alleyways. These interactions reinforced the harsh social stratification where only the documented, the wealthy, and the tolerated could call the city home. The homeless were reminders of urban cruelty, faced with a cycle of exclusion and punitive measures designed to maintain a fragile illusion of order. For those within the city, adapting to the environment posed a constant challenge. Cobblestone streets were unwelcoming for bare feet, and the city's ambitious architecture offered limited shelter. Streets charged with life by day harbored lurking threats as night fell. Violence and theft were constant companions, turning every alley into a potential ambush site. Those seeking safety faced gangs demanding coins for protection. And while alliances formed among the homeless, they were often as transient as the shelters they shared. The clothes they wore told stories of survival and loss, embodying battles won and humiliations endured under a city that sometimes embraced but more often rejected its temporary inhabitants. In terms of livelihood, life under the city lights was no fairer. Opportunities were just out of reach for those in ragged apparel. Despite a bustling marketplace, the homeless found themselves invisible, synonymous with trouble and disorder, and economic liability. Paradoxically, the city's prosperity relied on this underclass to perform menial tasks, ensuring the cycle of struggle continued in service of the city's wealth. For those unable to find work, the art of persuasion turned, begging into a delicate dance of trust and dependency, punctured by seasonal empathy from citizens more willing to give. Yet dangers loomed with guards and rival beggars threatening small mercies. Survival relied on a blend of rhetoric and resourcefulness, maintaining an uneasy position in an unforgiving social fabric. In times of disease, blame fell heavily on the homeless, wrongly cast as harbingers of contagion. Stigmatized and feared, they became convenient scapegoats, embodying the invisible threat lurking beneath urban prosperity. Foreigners seeking refuge from distant turmoil confronted xenophobia exacerbated during health crisis. Their accents marked them as outsiders, deepening mistrust and casting them as villains in a narrative of exclusion. The very presence of the homeless was a stark reminder of a society struggling towards an ideal not yet realized, with fear redirecting anger towards the most visible yet powerless members. Despite these challenges, the homeless navigated life as urban pilgrims, weaving through society in search of moments of solace and connection. Their stories, often untold, moved quietly through the city's tapestry, observing shifts unnoticeable to others. These tales spoke of unseen heroism and creativity in harsh solitude, painting a picture of resilience amid urban decay. Though their voices have faded into historical footnotes, the lessons of their journeys resonate in our modern empathy, reminding us of a shared humanity overlooked. In the courts, complex laws reinforced urban hierarchy with severe penalties for begging and vagrancy. Public humiliation awaited those caught. More a spectacle than justice, and without representation, the homeless were often victors only in tales of inequity told by others. Punishment turned public squares into theaters of admonition, granting no reprieve. Charity offered scant relief tied to moral judgments and religious obligations, leaving little room for unconditional aid. Those who received alms were subjected to scrutiny and moral sermons rather than the sustenance they needed. Cities, despite their promise, confronted the homeless with grueling realities. Behind thick walls of supposed progress, cries of despair echoed unanswered. In tales of suffering and survival written their alleys, the city's truths emerged. As forgotten voices of the past, their struggles offer a perpetual resonance. An unfinished story reminding us of the enduring fight for dignity in the shadow of prosperity. In the Dark Ages, being poor was a relentless battle against an uncaring world with scant hope of escape. Society's rigid structures kept the poor in a binds with wealth and privilege inaccessible to the majority. Education, that rare avenue of upward mobility, was a luxury for the elite. Without it, most were left to toil in ignorance. The homeless, seen as nuisances or worse, faced harsh laws and societal disdain. True escape from poverty seemed as elusive as shadows on a sunlit day, requiring a level of agency and choice that many simply didn't have. Opportunities were often fraught with peril. Some looked to the military as a potential way out, swapping one perilous existence for another. Enlisting meant food and shelter, but also the risk of dying in battle or returning maimed and destitute. For women, marriage might offer temporary stability, yet tethered them to the whims of a husband. Life was a precarious game where a single misstep could lead to ruin, yet amid such bleak prospects, hope flickered. A belief in miracles, divine favor, or a twist of fate that might change everything. Stories of miracles offered slivers of hope to the desperate. The medieval mind was steeped in religion where tales of miraculous healings and saintly interventions filled the imagination. Pilgrimages to sites of purported divine power were common with people traveling great distances seeking salvation through spiritual intervention. These stories of saints performing miracles akin to winning a cosmic lottery fueled the collective consciousness. Yet they were rare and often seemed like favors to everyone else. The church, a double-edged sword in these times, was both a savior and a judge. Monasteries offered some charity, albeit with strings attached. Conversion, confession, and labor were often asked of those who sought refuge. While the church provided what scant aid it could, its doctrines could be unforgiving. Poverty was sometimes seen as divine retribution or a personal failing, a narrative that shaped both aid and judgment. Charity, when available, was as restricted as it was precious. Various religious orders and guilds handed out alms more as a testament to piety than social responsibility. Charity was often a means to secure a place in heaven for the giver, more transactional than transformative. The poor faced discrimination in receiving aid with alms, sometimes only going to those deemed worthy by society's harsh standards. Often those most in need were overlooked, creating a paradox where charity was a blessing wrapped in obligation, a temporary patch on deep-seated social wounds. The lure of war was a desperate gamble. The impoverished saw military service as a tempting escape. It offered food, a bed of sorts, and a place under a lord's banner, yet at the risk of a life and limb. The conditions were grueling, and for many it was simply a trade of one harsh life for another. Stories of soldiers rising to knighthood or retiring with spoils were glorified exceptions. Still, this bleak gamble was embraced, a testament to the desperate human spirit clutching at straws. In a time where luck was as unpredictable as it was rare, few found their fortunes changing unexpectedly. Some stumbled upon an inheritance. Others found benevolent patrons willing to lift them from poverty if an inexplicable liking formed. These patrons, akin to medieval talent scouts, offered mentorship and education, creating improbable success stories that fed the hopes of the downtrodden. Yet these tales were exceptions. And for most, luck was an elusive partner, leaving dreams unfulfilled. Death hovered as a specter, offering the only true escape. In a world rife with disease, famine, and violence, it was ever present. To many, death wasn't just a tragic end, but a release from life's relentless struggle. It wasn't actively sought by the majority, but it lingered as a whispered thought, promising an end to hunger and pain. Beliefs in an afterlife offered comfort, painting death as a passage to divine grace. Even in death, there was talk of redemption, creating myths and religious symbols that romanticized the end as a bittersweet departure. Time has largely forgotten the homeless and poor of the medieval era, their lives written in the sands of history with anonymity. Unlike the chronicled lives of nobility, the marginalized left few records behind. Much of what we know comes from legal edicts and rare mentions painting a shadowy picture. Yet within this obscurity lay the profound tragedy of being unseen. Despite this moments of shared human experience, laughter and resilience shine through, echoing the idea that they too were vivid threads in history's tapestry. Even today, the shadows of medieval poverty cast insightful parallels. Inequality, exclusion, and power imbalances persist, their roots tracing back to these harsh times. Reflecting upon this era is a call to action, urging society to pursue justice and compassion. These tales of hardship underscore a need for systemic changes that prioritize inclusivity and dignity, lessons as relevant now as they were then. In closing, the Dark Ages offer a study in the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Across time's abyss, these stories of despair tempered with hope remain poignant, urging us to listen and learn. By acknowledging these forgotten voices, we invite their narratives to resonate anew, ensuring they weave into the living tapestry of today's understanding. As we flicker our way out of this dark tale and back into the light, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that uncover the past's strange wonders.